Hi and welcome back to the channel. Have you ever thought about the duality of human nature? Now, I'm not talking about the band Human Nature. I'm talking about good versus the evil, whether we're on the side of the angels or on the side of the devil. All that kind of binary stuff that we've had inherited from media, from religion and other things. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, really, and movies have thought about it a fair bit. So while I was digging through the vast library of movies that I've acquired over the years, I came up with an idea to compare and contrast two versions of the same story from 10 years apart in the classic era of Hollywood that show, interestingly, a few things. The first one is the power of censorship and the power of cutting away a lot of the more adult content in a movie. And the second part is how emphasis can be shifted by that cutting away of dealing with adult material in adult terms. The movies I've decided to use to tell that are from 1931 and 1941. Both big Hollywood movies, both the same story, and both from a classic work that everybody knows well. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, I'm kind of lucky. I got this Australian DVD pressing of the two movies on the one disc. And it's one of those old school ones that really cheeses me off a lot, because one movie's on one side of the disc and the other movie is on the other side of the disc. And it's sometimes difficult to work out which side of the disc you're looking at. Never liked that as a format. But anyway, I'm going to talk about them both. I've watched them both in the last 24 hours. And there are some vast differences. There are a lot of similarities because they use roughly the same script. But there are also a lot of differences. Before I start the usual thing, please consider subscribing, hitting the like button if you like this video, and hitting the notification bell if you want to find out when a new video comes out. They come out on a regular schedule. For me, it's Wednesday morning at 8 AM, and it's Saturday morning at 8 AM, but that of course varies depending on where you live. So, first off, I'm going to take a look at the 1931 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring Frederic March as the titular character, or characters, and Miriam Hopkins as Ivy, the girl he takes up with when he becomes Mr. Hyde. It was directed by Rouben Mamoulian, a really interesting director. He did a lot of good stuff in the 1930s. Here's a list of some of it. And he takes a really interesting approach at the start of the movie. Now, you've got to remember two things about this film. I think two things, but we'll see how we go. First one is, this is pre-code. This is before the Hays Code came in and censored anything remotely adult in Hollywood cinema. This is about a year and a half, 2 years before that. So the content is a lot more subtly graphic than you get in the 1941 version. That's the first thing. The second thing is, you've got to remember this is a sound movie from 2 years after sound came into movies. And it's kind of rough around the edges compared to the later version, which is much more slick. But I think it's got a lot going for it. The story we know from the Robert Louis Stevenson story, Dr. Jekyll is a man who is trying to find out a way of splitting the dual nature of humanity, the civilized one, the polite one, the one that Victorian England and the UK, where Stevenson lived at the time he wrote the story, accepted, the polite society version of humanity, versus the bestial, the lustful, the horny, basically, and the angry, violent side of human nature. Now, we know a lot more about this now than we did then. Human nature, the anger and violence can be mental illness, it can be disenfranchisement, it can be trauma. There are a whole bunch of reasons why people aren't their best selves in society. And it tends to kind of steer on a socio-economic scale, so that people who are broken and living in great poverty and with great suffering are more likely to commit crimes. We know all that stuff. So the whole idea of this movie is a little bit moot, given what we now know about sociology. But allowing that, Frederic March plays the upright Dr. Jekyll, who is engaged to a beautiful society lady, and he wants to get married soon. You can tell from the way it's framed in the movie that he's horny. He wants to get some, and his polite society won't let him go out and get a stray woman from the streets, and so he is pushing to get his marriage done. The father-in-law is kind of a bit wishy-washy about it, because Dr. Jekyll has some weird theories about the duality of human nature and being able to split off the negative from the positive sides of humanity using basically drugs. And so he's a little bit moody about it, but the couple want to get married. And you can tell from the approach that Frederic March takes while playing Dr. Jekyll that he's horny as hell. The movie starts a really interesting way too. You will see everything from the point of view of Dr. Jekyll, from him sitting at his harpsichord playing music. We see him go to the mirror, we see him get dressed, we see him get into a carriage. There's a very long take there. We then see him arriving at the medical school where he teaches and walking into the lecture theatre. It's a whole bunch of panning shots, a whole bunch of point of view, which makes us sympathise with the character, which is a really interesting approach, and it works tremendously well. And it's a little bit bold too. There's some really great bits of direction that draw attention to itself a little bit, but he's trying to find a different way to tell the story. He's not just using traditional techniques to get this across. Of course, Dr. Jekyll's opinions are controversial, and so he decides he's going to test his drug formula on himself and becomes the bestial Mr. Hyde. Now, the Mr. Hyde we get in the 1931 version is very kind of simian. He's kind of the 1930s idea of a caveman. He's got a low forehead, he's got bad teeth, he's got kind of dark baggy eyes, he's got flaring nostrils, he's got all of that kind of stuff that you associate with someone who's a bit bestial. In fact, he looks a little bit like one of the people on the Island of Lost Souls when he is in the Mr. Hyde version. And there are some really nice techniques used to show the transformation as well. So they use some different coloured facial makeup, which doesn't show up on black and white film, and then they put filters over the screen, which allows that makeup to be shown, so you can see him transitioning to having kind of shaded eyes and dark shadows around his cheekbones and things like that. It's a really nice little technique which is used in a number of different movies, but it does allow, before we had computer generated changes could be made to a human face, they were using everything they had to tell their story. Then you could use dissolves to tell the rest of the story about the transformation, and we end up with the bestial Mr. Hyde. Now, the thing that Frederic March does really, really well in this movie is the changes in physicality between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. His Mr. Hyde is not necessarily simian, but he's a wild creature. You can tell he's a predator. You can tell he's an apex predator. He looks around like that. He's kind of more alert to his environment. He's got situational awareness at a level that Dr. Jekyll doesn't. And he sees a young lady whom Dr. Jekyll has met before. She's kind of essayed as a sex worker, played by Miriam Hopkins. And she works in a music hall part-time. And Mr. Hyde takes up with her. And it doesn't end well for her, unfortunately. And Miriam Hopkins' Cockney accent's a little bit wishy-washy. In fact, the Cockney accents in both of these movies is pretty bad. But we get the usual run of the story. He's going from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to enable himself to find an outlet for his bestial urges that have no kind of consequences for Dr. Jekyll. They do for Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde ends up almost raping and dominating Ivy, the young woman played by Miriam Hopkins, in some very creepy ways and some very sadistic ways. He's a sociopathic monster as much as he is a physical looking monster. We see the lust of Dr. Jekyll, known as Dr. Jekyll in this because that's the correct pronunciation. We see his lust at a more polite level and a more kind of frustrated level. And we see Hyde letting that lust go and just running with it and damaging other people through it. Of course, the inevitable happens, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of blend, and Jekyll loses control of Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde appears without him taking the potion, and that ultimately leads to the disaster for the character. So to summarize for that first movie, it's really strong in being kind of honest about human lust. You can tell that Dr. Jekyll does have hidden passions, which he doesn't feel that he can legitimize because his wedding's been delayed and things like that. And Mr. Hyde has his. There's a bit of cleavage in this movie, which doesn't really appear in the subsequent version. It's a little more sanitized in the 1941 version. And the production values aren't as great as they are in the 1941 version. The budget's more limited. The setups for the studio aren't as advanced as well. You've got to remember there was a lot of change between 1931 and 1941 in Hollywood. Hollywood really learned how to do lighting better. They learned how to do sound design better. They learned how to make sets better and on a much larger scale. There's 10 years of progress showing between these two movies. The Jekyll we get from Frederic March is on point, and the Mr. Hyde, even though the makeup is a kind of an obvious one, is a powerful, bestial and very scary creature, particularly at a time when we're talking about men predating on women much more in society than we used to, and the Me Too movement and all those kind of things. A lot of Mr. Hyde in this movie and the other one does ring those particular bells in our contemporary society. Then we move on to 1941, directed by Victor Fleming, who had directed Gone with the Wind. The 1941 MGM version is a slick piece of production, and it suffers from the strictures of the production code. In fact, the first scene isn't seen from Dr. Jekyll's viewpoint. It's a pan in on a church tower, and a vicar, played by C. Aubrey Smith, is lecturing about the evils of human nature and the wages of sin and all that kind of thing. And Dr. Jekyll and his fiancée are sitting in the church, and there's a man at the back of the church who suddenly goes ballistic. He mocks Christianity, he mocks religion, he mocks what the preacher's saying, and he is kind of escorted out by Dr. Jekyll. And they find out that he's got an acquired brain injury. He's been in an explosion in an industrial place, and his brain hasn't been the same since. And so Dr. Jekyll wants to, and it's now Jekyll, not Jekyll as it is in the first movie, Dr. Jekyll wants to use him to test his experiments on the duality of human nature and repressing the bestial urges of human nature. It doesn't play out like that, and he's not given the opportunity by the medical people who are in charge of this poor guy to use him as a human experiment. So he continues his experiments on rabbits and mice until he decides to experiment on himself. Dr. Jekyll in this case is played by Spencer Tracy, who is a little bit too old. He's about 15 years too old for the role, but he does a pretty okay job of it. But the transition between Jekyll and Hyde isn't as pronounced as it is in the first movie. It's kind of watered down a little bit, except in one particular scene. Again, he meets a young woman called Ivy, played in this case by Ingrid Bergman, who is really good. Her Ivy, even though the Cockney accent is a little bit kind of Scandinavian Dick Van Dyke Cockney, it's still a strong acting role by Ingrid Bergman. She was originally hired to play the nice little fiancée, played in this movie by Lana Turner. Lana Turner was hired to play Ivy, the girl who is now a barmaid rather than a kind of sex worker because production code censorship. But Ingrid Bergman talked it over with Victor Fleming, the director, and said, "How about you test me for the Ivy role?" And he said, "The producers are never going to agree to that." And she said, "Well, why don't we do it in secret?" And so they secretly did a screen test with Ingrid Bergman playing Ivy, and she got the role because Victor Fleming was convinced she was really great in it, and he talked the producers around. And her Ivy is a lot more vital than the one played by Miriam Hopkins 10 years before. She's a strong person at the start. She knows how to handle men in the bar. She's vivacious. She's forthright. She plays a bit like a modern woman until she meets Mr. Hyde. And Mr. Hyde gaslights her. She was in Gaslight, wasn't she? Gaslights her and undermines her and almost hypnotizes her into being submissive in a sexual and sadistic role in their relationship. The weird thing about this movie in some ways, and the interesting thing is, that there's a lot more sexual sadism in the sensory version from 1941 than there was in the original version from 1931. They do some symbolic montages as Dr. Jekyll first becomes Mr. Hyde, where he's whipping horses and the horses suddenly turn into Lana Turner and Ingrid Bergman. There's a lot of kind of Freudian symbolism chucked into this movie to a point where it gets kind of humorous after a while. Whereas in the original one, the physicality of the acting by Frederic March carries that information. but the lust had to be kind of coded and hidden by doing all this Freudian symbolism of water lilies rising up out of the water, and a guy whipping horses that turn into women, and all this kind of other stuff that they do to essay the fact that Mr. Hyde is sexually sadistic. Totally unnecessary, because the acting covers that, particularly in a couple of scenes between Spencer Tracy and Ingrid Bergman. Now, this movie looks a lot better than the first one. It's got higher production values. It probably had a lot bigger budget. But the directing isn't as interesting as it was in Rouben Mamoulian's original version, which did the point of view shots. It really had a lot going for it that the second movie really doesn't have. Watching them back to back, you can kind of tell the difference. The makeup for Mr. Hyde too is a lot subtler than it was in the 1931 version. There are some dental appliances to change Spencer Tracy's teeth. There are shaggy eyebrows, and there's a false nose put on, and the face is lit differently as well. So his Mr. Hyde is a lot more like Dr. Jekyll, and you get to the point where you think, how does she not realise that this guy isn't Dr. Jekyll on a bad day? Because the facial similarities are kind of extreme, whereas in the first movie, the difference in appearance between Frederic March as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are profound. And you don't have that question of why aren't they seeing that this is the same guy? But kind of to summarise the two, they're both interesting, they're both great to watch, they're both part of horror cinema history. And so we should give them respect and maybe watch them too. I suggest you do, because they're both products of their time, but they do underline how rotten the production code was in censoring things. There's a visceral grittiness to the first version that the second version doesn't have. Now, which one's better? It's a bit hard to say. If I was going to cherry pick, what I'd do is I'd have Frederic March as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with Spencer Tracy's makeup and Ingrid Bergman playing Ivy. I think had they put all of those together, had they been able to put all those together, then they would have had a much stronger version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Jekyll, let's call the whole thing off. But the two of them together show us the transition in technology between the two eras, between just 10 years. The slickness of the MGM product of 1941 is really underlined by watching the two movies back to back. I'm not saying Spencer Tracy was bad, but he wasn't scary. He didn't have that kind of terrifying, out of control male sexuality that the original version had. And even though his Mr. Hyde is sadistic to the point of whipping women and things like that, the threat level is less than in the first movie, which is kind of interesting given the fact that the makeup in the first one is just so much more obvious. So just to finalise, I like them both. I think you should check them both out. I don't know whether you'll be able to find this particular version of it. I got this a decade ago to add to the horror movie library back in the other room. And it does give me that opportunity to compare and contrast the two. I'm not sure if they're on any streaming services, but they should be. I think they're a lot more, and I hit the tripod again, a lot more historic science fiction and horror, and this kind of blends the two really. Should be available on streaming services because they just are interesting, and it shows how far we've come in some ways and how some modern filmmakers could learn a lot from watching these classic films and the way that they're shot. So again, thank you for watching, and watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some classic horror movies and science fiction movies. Sometimes they're going to be a bit and sometimes you're going to really enjoy them, and you're going to see what these guys were going at with resources that were crazily more limited than you and I have even on our computers these days. So take care of yourselves, get the jab, wear a mask above your nose if you're in an area that requires it, and I'll catch you next time.